So next up for lecture 2, we'll be focusing on the life-saving service and their stations, and the U.S. revenue cutters, which together formed the U.S. Coast Guard in 1915. So we'll start with the life-saving service and their stations. The service itself was founded near Boston in 1786. And it really grew out of the concern by, private citizens for the, the humanitarian effort that would go into saving the lives of shipwrecked sailors and passengers on these ships. So they really existed through private funding and volunteers. And then in 1848, they began to receive funding under the Newell Act. So at this point, Congress appropriated about $10,000 and they established unmanned stations along the coast. So basically, it was a place where they could set up and provide so things like surf boats, rockets, carronades, necessary apparatus so that they could actually, when they were at the beach, have what they needed, for the better preservation of life and property from a shipwreck on the coast. So basically it provided those, and then it also provided further funding directly towards the original group of citizens that were the Massachusetts Humane Society. So the stations were administered by the U.S. Revenue Cutter Service, but they were only haphazardly funded until 1871. At this point, Sumner Kimball became the chief of the Treasury Department's Revenue Marine Division, and it was he who insisted that the stations receive sufficient funding to actually employ a regular crew. So soon these stations were added to, so along the coast of Maine and Cape Cod, the Outer Banks of North Carolina, and even farther down south. In 1878, the network of life-saving stations were considered a formally organized body and a separate agency, which they called the Life-Saving Service. So before 1900, there were few recreational boaters, and most times assistance was needed by ships engaged in commerce. So it was considered in everyone's best interest to do what they could to, keep trade and the merchants happy as any ships that were in harm's way, cargoes could be salvaged, etc. And of course, as the century progressed, there were more yachts and small personal boats that were out on the water and at times getting in harm's way. So at first, nearly all lifeboat stations were located near port cities. This is where, the main traffic for these commercial boats were going. And it was here in these areas with deep harbors that combined with piers, and there's waterfront, and so this meant that these heavy lifeboats could easily be launched into the water. However, on the outer beaches, so places like Wallace Sands, launching into a surf was far more difficult. So in about 1890, the station that you see there, the bottom right, that was Wallace Sands. And so that was built, so it's just south of the mouth of the Piscataqua River that comes into Portsmouth. However, they were 10 miles away from where the schooner Glendon wrecked at Hamden Beach in 1896. So Harry Lawrence came down with the crew from Wallace Beach, and he wrote an eyewitness report about their efforts that they took to save the crew of the ship. Once at the beach in the storm, they worked for hours to get the equipment in place. He notes that the lifesavers from the station rigged up their apparatus for shooting a line over the wreck. They fired several times, and finally they got the line into the rigging. This is where the crew had tied themselves in so that they would not be swept away by the huge waves coming up over the dock, like you can see in this photo here. Finally, the crew on the ship got the line tied up to the wreck. At this point, Lawrence states, when all was ready, one of the surfmen on shore started to pull in a breeches buoy, and you can see the close-up picture of someone standing inside. It's like a life ring with a pair of pants in it. So as the breeches buoy came towards them, the life-saving device slides along the rope in towards all the men who are pulling, and there they saw that it contained a sailor, and just before the man landed on the beach, he cried out to the lifesavers, "Well, hello, boys, great night out." Luckily, all the crew were landed ashore safely. Still, the disaster prompted the building of a new life-saving station there. So there at Hampton Beach, bottom right, you see the new station that was built in 1898. And on the left there, the wreck that was on our posters of the schooner Glendon. So then in 1915, the life-saving service was merged together with the revenue cutter service, which we'll talk about next. And together they formed the Coast Guard.